Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar where we'll be talking about the theory of multiple intelligences. Now, similar to learning styles, multiple intelligence has been around for a long time. In fact, decades. Even teachers and other educational professionals who have had a long career and retired probably would have learnt about multiple intelligences when they were back at university. It's literally been around, like most of the teaching strategies and things of that sort of nature, techniques and approaches and so forth. They've all been around, or probably 95% of them for a long time. Some of them over 100 years, if you've seen some of my other videos. Now, the theory of multiple intelligences, in my mind, is another way of differentiating the curriculum and your approach to actually teaching and delivering content. If you've seen my video on differentiation, then you would know that that is not a strategy, but a way of conceptualizing the way that you deliver your content and address the needs of a diverse range of students, so that those on the lower end and the higher end still get the benefit of a lesson plan, activity and level of difficulty that helps them develop from whatever point they're at to the next point in their learning sequence. Because as we know, most lessons, especially in bigger classes or even relatively small groups of say 6 or 7 students, lessons and activity plans are usually, or must be, directed to the masses. I always say directed to the masses, and that's because, let's say you have a class of 32, you only really create one lesson plan. There has to be a level of difficulty that lesson plan is delivered towards, and that's usually somewhere in the middle. So as far as students' ability is concerned. And then what we do as education professionals is differentiate the instruction a little bit, and so that way those on the lower end or the higher end, whether it's ability or interest or whatever, still can progress their learning in a way that is as close as possible to optimal, to the optimal level. Okay, so multiple intelligence is not as simple as learning styles. Learning styles, particularly with that VAK model, only have 3 different learning styles. And bear in mind, from that webinar or from that lecture, if you haven't watched it, please go do so after this particular video, because they kind of relate to each other in logical and rational sort of ways. And if you've already seen that webinar, you will know that there's 2 main points that comes from learning styles, as far as my personal opinion and experience is concerned anyway. The first thing is that I like to think of these types of strategies as preferred learning styles or preferred intelligences, not so much categorical methods of labeling students as one particular learning style or one particular intelligence. It's more like a preference, and the research shows that a lot. The research has consistently, for a long period of time, showed that students who say that they are visual learners don't actually learn much better than students who say they are auditory learners or kinesthetic/tactile learners when they are tested. It is more of a preferred way of learning. And obviously there will be a slight advantage there, but generally students who think that they're visual can learn just as well using other mediums, even though they may not enjoy it as much. So multiple intelligences is very similar in that I don't think it's fair to categorize a student as having an intelligence under the naturalistic category and to say that for the rest of them, they don't really matter, it's not that important. I actually think that how it should be considered, or the best way, I guess, to explain it and conceptualize the theory of multiple intelligences is that for these different categories, some students will be slightly better at this one, they may be less better at that one, probably okay at that one, and so on and so forth. So they might, for example, let's say we did a test for each of those, a test for that, a test for that, a test for that, a test for that, and so on and so forth. A particular student might score 90, let's say this is out of 100. They might score If it was verbal, linguistic, and then logical, mathematical, they're still going to do pretty well. And that's because, again, the research shows that if students are usually good at one area, say they're good at maths or whatnot, they're generally going to be relatively good at most other areas as well. So if they're good at reading, they are going to be good at writing in almost all cases. If they're going to be good at maths, they're going to be good at science. But also, and surprisingly, there is that correlation when the education researchers do tests and things that shows that if they are good at maths, they are going to generally be better at reading and writing and various other things where you wouldn't normally think there is that correlation, but in actual fact, there is. So visual spatial, now let's say that they're an 82 at that one, and they're a 70 at that, and they're a 47 at that. Interpersonal, let's say that again is another 70. Intrapersonal, let's say they get a 42. And naturalistic, let's say they get a 98. I'm just making these up. So now you can see how what the point of this is to actually say that students can have an intelligence. And by intelligence, I probably should have mentioned this earlier, this is really a competing model against the standard IQ type measurement. And as you know, the standard IQ, if you've ever done one of those online IQ tests, it tests things like your ability to do word associations, it tests your working memory capacity and various different things like that. A lot of maths and problem solving type questions. So generally you can think of IQ as, I guess you could think of it like problem solving, right? Problem solving, and it does involve a little bit of word type things, but generally people think of the IQ, the traditional sort of IQ test as a problem solving type intelligence. Now, that's not to say that there's anything horribly wrong or that people with a high IQ actually have been measured wrong or anything like that. What the multiple intelligences model does propose is that that's very limiting, because a person can have, say, an IQ of 140 here, which is sort of a genius IQ, bearing in mind that 100 is the average IQ. Now, what that means is that that person is probably going to have a high IQ up here for these ones. They might score 90 and 92 or something like that for that particular intelligence. But they could also just as easily score quite low for other areas. So if they were really good at maths, but they might be horrific at music. And in that sense, their IQ for music, so their musical, I'm just going to use the word IQ to explain it, although it's not technically correct. So their musical IQ or their musical intelligence is really low. So it equals 47, which is actually very low. So this is the whole idea of multiple intelligences, is that there are multiple different ways that people, not just students, but people can demonstrate or can approach, conceptualize, learn, and so on and so forth. So applying that into, so just first, let's just quickly run through what these different areas, what these different intelligences mean, very sort of broadly speaking, and then we'll go on and have a bit of a chat about how they applied in the education sector or in classrooms and so on and so forth. So the first one up the top is verbal linguistic. So verbal linguistic is basically being able to use language. So students can read, write, be able to use different grammatical structures. They're quite often avid readers. Verbal has a lot to do with obviously speaking language. So that's people that can socialize really well and interact with other people really well. They have a lot of critical literacy skills. So that's, imagine a professional writer, or your typical English class is what we would consider a really good example of that verbal linguistic area. So, and that's heavily related. These also overlap a lot as well. So that's the other thing to bear in mind, because you do have the interpersonal intelligence down the bottom here. So obviously the interpersonal, which involves that backwards and forth between one or more individuals, that social sort of effect. Obviously, verbal intelligence and interpersonal, just be careful there with the ER and intra. are heavily related. And even with other ones like the bodily kinesthetic, if you're playing sports and things, there's a lot of communication that happens in teamwork and team games and things like that. Okay, so that's the first one. The second one is the logical mathematical, and generally that one's a spatial ability, mathematical ability, statistics, graphs, diagrams, data, all those types of things. So really you could think of this one as your English class, your typical English classroom or language classroom, and this one as your maths class or your numeracy class. Then we've got we've got the visual spatial. So you can see how the visual spatial ones are these two are closely related, just like that one is closely related to interpersonal. So if the logical mathematical one is a bit more on the mathematical side, data and statistics and so forth. The visual spatial one is being able to imagine 3D objects, spaces, mapping, those types of things. So those two are very closely related, I would imagine. Then you've got your bodily kinesthetic, and that one's about doing things. So it's your fine motor and gross motor skills. So for example, playing sports, knitting, arts and crafts, those types of things. And that one involves also learning by doing. So fixing cars, woodworking, metalwork, and so on and so forth. Now, this is an area one where your average sort of tradie, say an electrician, plumber, those type of things, particularly those people who are really good at not just fixing things, but fixing a wide variety of things. They're sort of master, what's that saying? Not a master of all trades, yeah, whatever that is. So if people who are the handyman and they can do lots of different things, so they might be able to do the handyman stuff around the house, but they're also good at cars, and so on and so forth. So those type of people, and let's just write anything that's sort of gross and fine motor is that particular one there. And those type of people may actually score really high here, if let's say they're a woodworker or whatnot, but they might score really low in other areas. And conversely, you could also score really high in quite a lot as well. There's no reason why a person couldn't score 90, 90, 90, 90, and so on and so forth. Or in the case of special needs students or people with special needs or additional needs, they may actually score quite low in a lot of them. And we'll go through some of the reasons for that and the ways in which we can deal with that as teachers and teacher aides or trainers at some point in the later on in this webinar. Then you've got interpersonal. Just be careful with there's the musical and rhythmic one. I won't cover that one because I think that's relatively straightforward. Then you've got the interpersonal and the intrapersonal. Now, interpersonal is that ability to socialise. I generally say that simply means the person has a high emotional IQ. It's another buzzword that you would have seen floating around the last few years. A high emotional IQ, which basically means they've got the ability to, for example, work with and empathise with people, to be able to help people when they need assistance if they're going through mental traumas. They're the type of person that is good at those types of things. Another way to think of that interpersonal, kind of related to the verbal one as well, is that they've got more so down here, the gift of the gab. So they are the type of people that could sell almost anything to anyone type of thing. Then you've got the intrapersonal. So that's more about the spirituality side of things, looking inwards as opposed to outwards. And I generally associate that one with reflective practice. So the type of person that is interested in continual improvement and bettering themselves and so on and so forth. And then you have the naturalistic. And the naturalistic person is the type of person who enjoys working with animals, outside, nature. They might become an environmentalist or something like that later on in life. Farmers, all those types of people who, I guess you could say, have an affinity with nature or really enjoy or are drawn towards those type of areas. Anything to do with animals, those types of things. So they're the different types of intelligences based on this particular model. And again, with all of these different models, there are variations. The person that invented this, or the original version, his name is Howard Gardner. Howard Gardner, and I think last time I was looking this up 6 months ago or so, I think I vaguely remember reading that he only just retired, so he's still alive today. I'm not 100% sure on that. But and that just goes to show how old some of these strategies are, but yet they are still applicable. And a lot of things we do in education these days, I think there's a lot of neuroscience-y type pseudoscience programs out there, and they're all basically just ways of taking the things that we've known for a long, long time, packaging it up with new fancy titles, saying that it's based on science and so on and so forth. But in all the research I've done over the years, and all the reading I do, academic papers and textbooks and things like that, the one thing I have noticed with all these strategies is that they have been around for a long, long, long time. Anyway, so I think Howard Gardner, I think it was him, was also saying, this is just a little bit of a side note, that there are obviously different other types of intelligence that may exist. Now, when Howard Gardner came up with that, because it was such a long, long time ago, it was a different time, I guess. So now there is some arguments that there are 2 or 3 other different types that could be included in there. And I think that for me, I suppose I'm a bit more of a traditionalist. I like to just use the traditional or original model that exists and not one of the new trendy ones. Bearing in mind that no matter which model you use, there are always problems with them. There's problems with this one, there's significant overlap, and with all of them, they're really just a preference anyway, and we don't use them from an ideological point of view or from a purist point of view. We use them as one of many tools to help us in delivering a better quality product to our clients or to our students. So anyway, there are a few other ones, and you might be able to even invent some yourself. One that was suggested is digital, which is actually pretty relevant these days. I can't remember when this came out. I think it was probably late 60s or early 70s or something. So that's sort of, obviously that's sort of old. There are and were computers and technologies and things back then, but I'm not sure if the word digital was widely used. What was that, nearly 50 years ago or something like that? 40 years ago, so quite some time ago. Another one is pedagogical. Sorry if you can't read that. So pedagogical expertise. So that's the ability or knowledge and skills to be able to teach other people. I think that kind of goes, I think that's probably in there because of the bias of not only, I guess it's inventor, but also the people who work in this sort of space or research this area or teach this area. They're all going to be teachers. So there's probably just a little bit of a bias there as far as why that. I wouldn't say there's any agreement to include all these other ones, but certainly personally, if I was doing this and trying to implement it in a school environment, and again, we'll go through how to do that in a minute, I wouldn't be really too worried about the pedagogical one. It doesn't really serve any value as far as helping kids out. Obviously, we try and get better at what we do as many different ways as we can, but so I wouldn't be too concerned with that one. And there's quite a few other ones. There's lots of different suggestions. So if you jump onto Google and have a look around, I think the Wikipedia page for multiple intelligence lists quite a few as well, or it did last time I had a look at it. However long ago was that? And a few more might come to me as we go through and do this webinar. Okay, so let's just have a quick look then at how, we'll get rid of that. Let's just have a quick look at how this particular strategy or this particular concept, I guess it's probably more of a concept than anything, how it can actually be used by teachers, by teacher aides, by those in the corporate world, by people that are developing curriculum and so on and so forth. So as with any of these strategies, and as we were saying before, this is a type of differentiation. So it gives us that ability to deliver a slightly different product to different students or to different clients. So the first thing that we'll put up here is it is a differentiation tool. So that's the most important thing to remember, because I would never deliver, if I was doing a lesson or a program and it was heavily verbal linguistic, let's say a standard English class, and I'm an English teacher by trade, even though I spent heaps of time teaching maths and other things. I am an English teacher, so this particular area here, if I was teaching an English class, let's say, I don't know, year 10s, then I would certainly be trying to consider how I could add other things in. Now, particularly with year 10s, you might want to do some stuff here, so especially what was known as MI, or movement integration. So that's getting people up out of their seats and doing things. I think there's, well, I don't think there is. I know there is a lot of research out there that shows that integrating movement with actually trying to learn things, even if it's just going for a walk or throwing a ball or doing something that involves getting the blood flowing a little bit. It doesn't mean running around or anything silly, but anything other than sitting in a seat, I think can certainly help. Acquire knowledge, it can help with understanding concepts and so on and so forth, and also with that recall in the future. So I would certainly be adding some of that into a lesson, even if we're learning short stories or writing an essay or analysing adverts or a movie or whatever. Certainly you'd want to do at least something in every couple of lessons, I would say, even if it's just a small sort of activity of some description. And it might not always be possible, but certainly it gives you more options as well. Obviously, musical and rhythmic, that one's very easy to add in an English classroom anyway, because you can do things like lyrics, and you can do games that involve music, and so on and so forth. And also that sort of, particularly that rhythmic side of it and that bodily side of it, you can see how there's a bit of a relationship there anyway. And for me, I'm not really a musical sort of person, but if you are working in a class and that is right up your alley, then certainly you can start adding those types of things in more easily. For me, that's not really something that I'm overly good at. I don't know how to play any instruments or whatnot, so I wouldn't spend too much time on that one. But again, it gives us options in that particular class to address students who have a preferred learning style or a strong interest in anything that is musical. So if there were behavioural issues, and we might think that, okay, well, this student's got behavioural issues and is always out of their seat or trying to get kicked out of class for whatever reason, and we're delivering a lesson that's mainly around here, but what if we start adding some of these other things in? Which one of those is most attractive to that particular student and would boost their motivation quite considerably? And it might just be that one. And that could involve, for example, listening to the radio or doing some type of research report or investigation into trends in the music industry or something like that. So you can be quite creative with it. And we also have the interpersonal. So that one, as we were saying, is more about socialising. So that's where you're doing your group work and you're doing not so much maybe group assignments and so forth. So that one's relatively easy in many regards because a lot of teachers, teacher aides already include a lot of interpersonal activities into their teaching practice, particularly if you're doing some type of variation on explicit instruction, which a great majority of classes are run that way. So I'd watch my other videos on explicit instruction if you haven't already seen that one, because explicit instruction is a good basis to be able to develop your teaching skills and strategies before moving on or maintaining it, as a lot of people do. But if you were interested in doing other strategies, then you can sort of mix it in with that explicit instruction model. So it gives you that foundational way to deliver lessons that I think personally works quite well. So, and usually about 20 or 30 odd % of your lesson, depending on students. So that year 10 lesson I was talking about, maybe 20 or 30% of the lesson sounds reasonable in terms of having some type of group work there, pair work. It's also giving students the opportunities to respond, the opportunities to answer questions, the opportunities to practice with friends. And there's a lot of other teaching strategies out there that would really try and address that, such as learning by failure, learning by peer review, peer mentoring, as we were saying before, any types of group work type activities such as brainstorming, or off the top of my head, debating is another one, class discussions, Not sure if I said jigsaws before, which is where students pass around. You have groups and you'll come up, do a brainstorm of sorts, and then pass that piece of paper to the next one, and then that group will add to it. Okay, so that's the interpersonal one. Intrapersonal gets a little bit harder, but I like to just think of that in terms of reflection. So some people are into that continual improvement or into that spiritual side of things. So you can integrate parts of that into your lesson as well. And the naturalistic, so that one's, again, relatively easy to embed in a lot of the cross-curriculum priorities, as they're called these days. Involve things like climate change and sustainability and so on and so forth. So you have that ability there to add in some activities or you could even get animals involved somehow. I remember one class I had, we had a couple of guinea pigs so there are various different ways that you can involve animals, plants, the environment, nature, sustainability, those types of things, even into an English lesson. Now, the other thing is that we don't need to, and that naturalistic, by the way, can be as simple as just getting out of the classroom, a little bit of movement integration, but also it can just involve sitting under a tree, sitting outside. That's not perfect as far as what is meant by naturalistic, but it's certainly heading in that direction a little bit. Okay, so they're the main different multiple intelligences, and as I was saying, there are a few other ones. I do like the digital one because I think that should definitely be considered as one of the intelligences that you could. Let's put it here, particularly in this day and age. Now, the other thing to bear in mind with these is that you will have your own preferences as well. So as I was saying before, music's not really my thing, so I probably wouldn't be doing too much of that in a particular class. I'm fully cognizant and aware of what areas I'm more, attracted to and what areas I would avoid. So I definitely would make sure that even with that bias, I am trying to do some activities along that line every now and then, particularly if I knew that I had students who fell into that category, and particularly if those students were causing problems from a behavioural point of view or a motivation point of view or whatnot. And even students that are doing quite well, if they do have that interest, then it doesn't hurt to, give them what they want type of thing, because it just makes life easier. The more students are motivated, not only is that good from their development perspective, but obviously the more students are motivated, then the less issues you're going to have and the less stringent and strict you need to be from a delivery perspective. Okay, cool. So anyway, we got off track a little bit. So yes, it's a differentiation tool. Obviously, it's used for planning. And obviously, you can use it for resource development as well. So by planning, as I just went through and showed you there, you could do, I wouldn't do 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, but the same with the learning styles. As you're going through and developing different lessons and activities and things, you may just stop and think and go, okay, well, how can I add that into what I'm currently doing? Or how could I add that and that one? Because we don't really do much of that. And let's see how it goes. And you might be surprised that you think, well, we'll chuck in some musical rhythmic stuff, even though we're doing a hardcore maths lesson on algebra. Let's just chuck that in. How could we involve that? And let's just see what happens. And you'll be surprised at how many students suddenly change their tune as far as being interested in that particular topic, or they engage in that lesson. And then you may think, oh, I've got something here. We're definitely going to have to add that in more regularly in the future. And you can have a chat to students after class about what they sort of thought about doing it in that way as well. Now, the other thing that I use these for is concept acquisition. Nothing more embarrassing than spelling a word wrong while you're doing a YouTube video. Concept acquisition. Now, what I mean by concept acquisition, that's not a technical term that you'll read anywhere. I guess I kind of just made that up. But concept acquisition means that... okay, so let's backtrack a little bit. For those that have seen my videos, you will have seen me talk about a thing called... No, I'm not going to do it there. You may have heard me talk about... Let's change pen. Blue, there we go, so we can see. You may have heard me talk about concept understanding. I'm going to write this up because it is important. Super important, in fact. Concept understanding versus task completion. And I drum on about this a little bit, but I think it's super important. It's not something that they teach anywhere. Now, there's a lot of research that shows that untrained teacher aides, parent helpers and so forth give students the answers to the questions just under 70% of the time, whereas really experienced teachers give students the answers to those questions that they receive from students around, I think it's 11% of the time. And my sort of thoughts would be that really good teachers are probably doing it more like 5% of the time or something like that. Now, what that shows us is that a lot of people working or helping out in classrooms or inexperienced trainers, whatever, are concerned with task completion. That means students finish a task. They've done the 10 questions. Our goal for this lesson is to do 10 questions. That is bad practice, very bad practice, because watch my videos on goal setting, by the way, but your goal setting is never, I don't know what the math symbol for never is, your goals, say you have 3 goals. When you set goals for a lesson or activity, you never set goals that say we want to complete a task. Well, sometimes you do, but very rarely. Normally they will say understand algebra basics or something like that, right? So that understand algebra basics is not and is very different to complete 10 questions, because if you want students to complete 10 questions, well, you can do that in no time. They can just copy each other or whatever. If you want them to do it on their own, then they can go through and do it on their own. But it's not what I would consider to be a learning goal. And generally speaking, in a lesson, if you have 10 questions that you're going to work through, bear in mind that those questions are not really that relevant. It's not that relevant whether they get to number 10, whether they get to number 2, whether they only do 1 question. It's probably a bit of an issue if they only do 1 question, but the main thing that you're looking for is concept understanding. Now, that means that the students understand the concept behind the questions that you're asking, the procedures, the reason why things are happening, and so on and so forth. So if you're doing 10 algebra questions, and they only get 3 questions done, I would rather they get 3 questions done but be able to do be able to answer those same but slightly different questions, so different inputs and things, different context, 2 weeks later, a month later, whatever, and they could answer the first 3 or 4 without any problems or additional help, maybe a bit of a revision to remind them of what's going on, than if they did 10 and had really no clue on what they were doing. So it's very important to, so point is, it's very important to concentrate on concept understanding, both in your planning as well as if you're managing other people like teacher aides and so forth, and particularly if you are a teacher aide, because this is not something you will have studied in the past, unless you studied with us, of course. So make sure you're concentrating on concept understanding. Now, quite often, you will also have teachers who are very worried about task completion, and so somehow tactfully, I guess, having that conversation that task completion actually is not the goal. The goal is concept understanding. Better off having one lesson where they do 2 or 3 questions out of 10 but have a solid understanding, and then the next lesson they do the next question or 2 but have a solid understanding, and they can start putting it all together. And over a period of a few lessons, those 10 questions, they've absolutely mastered it, and then they'll be able to do those questions and those basics the following year and so on and so forth, as opposed to getting 10 done today, 10 done tomorrow and so forth, but not really understanding what's going on. So I've gone on about that for a little bit. And the reason why I've just backtracked a little bit to talk about that is because these can help with that concept acquisition or concept acquisition, concept understanding. 2 slightly different things, but concept understanding is at the very end, the level that they get to, so they need to understand, say, how to do the basics of algebra. Concept acquisition is the process of going from 0 to being able to do something. So anyway, that doesn't really matter. And you can use any of these to help a student go through that concept understanding page, concept acquisition process, so that they get to the point of concept understanding. So You might be in a pure maths lesson doing algebra, the student is really struggling, and you may stop back and think, okay, which of these could I use to assist the student to develop that concept understanding so that they understand how to do those algebra type things. And if you were writing essays, for example, just to throw out an example there, then maybe you could use musical because lyrics are divided into certain sections as well. So you can draw on those different, I guess, metaphors and links to build on a student's existing knowledge and existing interests, and then draw links from that to where you need them to be as far as the content and the concepts that you're currently studying. So anyway, that's concept acquisition, and I think I've spent enough time talking about that, and I'll just rub that one off. Probably should have left that, but just in case we need the room. Right, so they're probably the 4 main reasons for why multiple intelligences can be used. There is a couple of others that we have spoken about. Motivation, slash self-esteem. Obviously, you might get some students who are quite disengaged, particularly if you're working in, say, a remedial or intervention type program. And if you can take content, again, let's say we're trying to teach students how to write. Well, maybe we can do something more interesting and we can do blogs. Or maybe we can do a combination, again, the musical type thing, we can listen to radio and podcasts or whatever, but we can also write out parts of it and do summaries and things like that. So again, that increases motivation, and by increasing motivation, you can improve self-esteem by hitting goals. So if you're setting out to teach students how to do something or to produce a product of some description, then if students are motivated, that will boost their self-esteem. And the number one way to boost self-esteem is by hitting goals. So they will be able to write a paragraph to a certain standard. You can give them some positive feedback on that, and so on and so forth. So it's a bit of a cycle there. I think probably self-esteem might come before motivation, maybe after. I think maybe it's a bit of both at the same time. But yeah, if students do have a high level of self-esteem, which basically means they feel that they can do something, then that's going to improve their motivation. And my personal opinion anyway is that the number one way to improve motivation / self-esteem, actually that's a better way to do it. Let's do motivation / self-esteem. Yeah, is by having students hit goals. So at the start of the lesson, you set a goal that you understand the basics of algebra. At the end of the lesson, if they can understand algebra, even if students don't like maths, then that's certainly going to boost their motivation and that feeling that, yes, I can achieve this, and they're more likely to come in the following lesson and to have a go and to at least give it a shot type of thing. Okay, so one of the other... Obviously, we spoke about this before, is behaviour. Now, behaviour, obviously, behaviour management. And general, just variety, I think. Yeah, so behaviour management and variety. So there are 2 other reasons for why I think the multiple intelligences type method or model can be used. Sometimes, obviously, that and that are kind of related to each other. But also, if you get a student and you're working one-on-one with a student or a small group and they just don't understand something, whatever that happens to be, then either using the multiple intelligences model or the learning style model can be a really good way of conceptualizing things or looking at things in a slightly different way, and maybe one of these will help them get across that line so that they understand what's going on. So that's the basics of Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences. Thank you for watching.